Hi, class. I want to go over some of the more difficult learning objectives of Unit 4 as you prepare for the exam. We're talking about chapters 15 through 18, post-war period. The first chapter on the post-war, in a lot of ways, builds on some of the issues that we've talked about earlier in the course, like the divisions within the Democratic Party of the 1920s, and also the economic gains for blue-collar workers and for labor in the 1930s under the New Deal, because those were now contested and those were up for grabs after World War II ended. I'm talking about things like, for instance, the basic right to collective bargaining, whereby management has to negotiate with unions rather than just firing them. And the minimum wage. We kind of take it for granted that those things, along with Social Security, were permanent fixtures of the New Deal, and they have been so far in retrospect, but it wasn't clear at the time whether those were temporary or going to be long lasting. And so World War II created a situation where both sides put their differences aside temporarily until the war ended. And then what happens as soon as World War II is over, then they start arguing right away. And labor initiates several huge strikes in areas like steel and auto and coal and things like that, where these were interconnected strikes, which is to say you had a whole bunch of industries striking all at the same time, which can really slow down the economy a lot. So we think of the post-World War II economy as this big boom in American history, which it was overall, but there were some, they stumbled out of the block there. The first years, 1945, 46 or so, the economy went into a recession. There's oftentimes this adjustment period right after a war. There were housing shortages, and there were these big arguments between labor and management. And the Republicans in Congress were able to push back on labor a little bit and weaken it with the Taft-Hartley Act that outlawed these secondary strikes, these interconnected strikes, and attempted to outlaw closed shops as well, where you had to join a union if you were going to work at that place, various other little features. And they were somewhat successful in weakening the Wagner Act of 1935 and weakening labor a little bit, but they were never able to get rid of the core right to collective bargaining. So it's not like they undid all of the gains of the New Deal. Now, what Harry Truman was trying to do with the Fair Deal, which is less famous than the New Deal, mainly because it was less successful, is to build on the New Deal. And he was really walking a tightrope here in terms of the Democratic Party was in danger of splitting back up into the same two camps that they had been in the 1920s, with a more progressive and liberal, mainly northern camp. And then you had the old so-called Solid South, the remnants of the Confederacy, really, that were much more conservative, not only on racial matters, but also toward the New Deal in general. And Harry Truman, who very few Americans really even knew who Harry Truman was when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. Most people, young people, didn't even have memories of any president other than Franklin Roosevelt at that point, because he'd been in there for 3 1/4 terms. But Harry Truman was trying to patch together the Democratic Party, and he had the Dixiecrats from the South were threatening to break away not only from the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, but also even threatening secession. And then you had the more progressive plank led by Henry Wallace and others. And Truman, he, on the one hand, he tried to marginalize the more progressives and called them communists, etc. But he more or less did side with the progressive wing of the party and basically hung the Dixiecrats and the racists out to dry. So the Democratic Party then was torn on where they stood on race, all the way up through, from Truman, all the way up through the mid-1960s, which you see later in this unit, where they basically expunged or cut the cord with the old Solid South, the racist branch of the party. Mostly cut the cord, not completely. So Harry Truman, in other words, he's going to try to push this New Deal that's going to build on is going to push the Fair Deal, which builds on the New Deal by trying to add civil rights legislation as part of the Democrats' platform, while also building on the economic gains of the New Deal, like, for instance, by adding universal health care insurance. The United States is one of the few developed countries on earth that does not have healthcare insurance from the government, other than we do for those over 65 with Medicare, and some coverage for the poor at the state levels with Medicaid. Those come later in the 1960s. At first, Harry Truman, like Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican back in the early part of the century, was trying to promote the idea of just having everybody pay their taxes into a system that would then have total coverage for everybody. Single payer, as it's sometimes called, universal health care insurance. There are several reasons why we don't have that in the United States, and not all of those reasons come from conservatives. There's also labor unions in the 1930s and 40s that thought they could gain by offering that as a benefit, one of the benefits that they won in negotiations with management. And you read earlier in the World War II chapter about how Franklin Roosevelt, he capped wages during the war while we had full employment in order to prevent inflation. But that meant that employers then started to add benefits as part of their packages, which included healthcare insurance from companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield. So the story as to how we ended up with this weird system, this mainly employer-based system for healthcare in the United States, is complicated, and we'll talk about it more later. But what's interesting about the Fair Deal is that it mostly failed. They did get a small raise in minimum wage. They did get some things added to Social Security, like cost of living adjustments, COLAs as they're called, and then eventually disability coverage also, which formally came in actually under Dwight Eisenhower, who was Truman's successor. But there were some small gains there with the Fair Deal. But it's generally seen as a failure because of their inability, their failure to add the civil rights legislation to the Democratic Party's platform. That would not come until 20 years later, in the mid-1960s. And then also their failure with the healthcare insurance idea. But the point I make in the book there is that, just to borrow a phrase from sports, sometimes offense is the best defense. And what I mean by that, I understand that not all of you are sports fans, and so I apologize if I'm drawing an analogy to football here, but let's say that your team has a lead in football and they get the ball in the fourth quarter, and they start marching down the field slowly, methodically, gaining first downs, most importantly, chewing up the clock as they're doing it. Well, that's almost better than playing defense, because the other team doesn't have the ball. And that's what happened with the Fair Deal, is that we always say, oh, it failed to do this, it failed to do that. That's true. But what didn't happen? What didn't happen was the whole New Deal got reversed. So in other words, by staying on offense and having a few gains here and there and failing on offense, Harry Truman at least had the Democratic Party not back on their heels playing defense with the entire New Deal getting overturned. Like, for instance, Republicans getting rid completely of Social Security and getting rid completely of the minimum wage or the right to collective bargaining for unions, which did remain on the books, even though it's been weakened quite a bit in modern times. So the Fair Deal, kind of an extension of the New Deal, I guess you could say. The Democrats were starting to brand their administrations, and so you had the New Deal, and then you had the Fair Deal. Later, we're going to have John Kennedy's New Frontier and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. They also liked acronyms, it seems, with FDR, and then we had JFK and LBJ. I guess you might as well stick with a winning formula as long as it's working. Moving on in that chapter, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about white flight. You can read more detail on that on your own. I think those learning objectives are fairly straightforward. The basic idea being that when suburbs incorporate, and turn themselves technically into townships or separate municipalities, then they're not sharing their tax revenue with the city, and they're able then to draw their property tax revenue from more prosperous homes, and that then turns into usually a more favorable public school system that way. Austin developed in a little bit different way. We didn't have a whole lot of suburbs that really spun off completely on their own. We later ran into existing cities like Cedar Park and Round Rock. But Austin, definitely race had a huge role to play in Austin, the way with the 1928 city plan and the way they basically tried to cordon off racial minorities in East Austin. The chapter also talks about how with the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, the federal government had to build these big interstates through cities. And since they have the right to eminent domain, they can take out neighborhoods. Usually they took out poorer neighborhoods, because then they would have less to compensate for that way. And so a lot of ghettos got barreled through with these new interstates. Austin's a little bit different situation. They actually took out a pretty nice street here. This is the old East Avenue in Austin, which is where I-35 now is. But they still did use it more or less as a way to create kind of a wall, you could think of, between these areas that they had set aside in East Austin and downtown. Moving on to chapter 16, I believe this is. Yeah, it's the 1960s, an overview of the 1960s. One of the more difficult learning objectives that pops up in this chapter is the one, learning objectives 3 and 4, where we talk about the 1964 election and how it triggered these changes in voting patterns, and who passed the civil rights legislation of 1964, the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 are generally associated with the Democratic Party, and rightfully so, insofar as Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat from Texas, was president of the United States, helped push these through Congress and sign them as president. And I often have a lot of students that talk about, say, hey, the Democrats, they seem to be the racist party back in the Civil War era and the early 20th century, and their association with the Ku Klux Klan, and that's all true. And so why did this huge switch happen? People talk about the big switch. Well, there was kind of a switch, but it was not any thoroughgoing switch where everyone on the Republican Party all of a sudden converted over and became racist or anything like that. It was much more complicated than that, because the senators, and that's who pushes through legislation, are the congressmen in the House and Senate. If you look at the vote count, for instance, of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there were actually more Republican congressmen and senators that voted for it than Democrats. So this was led by Everett Dirksen here of Illinois, a Republican. But the reason we have that image of the Republican Party as turning against the civil rights movement is because their presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, did oppose the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. So that wing of the party ends up kind of taking the reins and really dictating the platform from the 60s up through the 70s or so. Now, Barry Goldwater wasn't necessarily opposed to minority citizenship personally, but he did take a stand against these legislations as being an overbearing national government. He favored states' rights. States' rights is something you always want to be a little bit leery of, because my experience has been that people are almost always very selective in when they favor states' rights and when they don't, whether it suits them or not. It's really more of whether they favor the issue usually. But what happened was when Goldwater then ran as a Republican in '64 against the civil rights legislation, then you have a really important shift in American politics here, because if you look at these states in red here in the Southeast that went for Goldwater, this is his home state over here of Arizona, that is the heart of the old Confederacy. And those are all states that had never gone Republican before. Obviously, back in the Civil War era, the Republicans were the enemy. They would not have voted for Abraham Lincoln or anything like that. And likewise, the old party of the Confederacy now starting to take over the New England states because of their pro-Civil War, pro-civil rights stance. So there's a little bit of a switch there. Not all of the Southerners went with the Republican Party. In fact, the more racist, hardcore racist in the South, they tended to break off with George Wallace, who was a Democrat, and then went off on his own as a rogue Democrat / independent. But this issue over how is the Republican Party going to deal with the South, what is their, quote, Southern strategy, this is going to be a theme that we continue on with later in the later chapters. The chapter on civil rights has far more than we can possibly unpack here all at the same time. But I do want to talk about one of the themes that pops up in this chapter a couple times, actually 3 times really, is the issue of jury duty. Because I think if you're like most of us, you get a jury notice, whether it's in the mail or email, and you might sort of groan and think, oh, geez, this is a hassle because, you know, I'm raising kids or I'm busy with work and now I have to miss my job, and it seems like a pain. But a key part of your rights as a citizen are your rights to serve on a jury. You should consider it a privilege to serve on a jury, as more or less all Americans now have the right to. Because trust me, if you were ever part of any sort of demographic that did not have the right to sit on a jury, well, that demographic would invariably and inevitably be discriminated against by the judicial system. It's just a matter of human nature. You can see a dramatic example of that with the Emmett Till case in Mississippi in the 1950s, where there was really no doubt that the perpetrators had murdered this young boy. They didn't deny that. However, they went into the courtroom knowing that an all-white jury would never convict them. And this is just rubbed in Americans' faces because it was all over the newspapers. The photograph of Emmett in his casket was published all over the country and the world. And you had news coverage, on the television now for the first time. And so Americans were really confronted with the injustice of their entire society at that point. You have problems with juries continuing on up through the 1990s with 2 very high-profile cases in Los Angeles that you could kind of think of as bookends, one in 1991 and 92, and then the other in 94 and 95, but the first with Rodney King, who somebody happened to capture on video being brutally beaten by the LAPD. Those officers then went to trial and they were exonerated by an all-white jury because they had moved the case from Los Angeles out to Simi Valley, which was a white suburb. That case is really a precursor, a presages what's going to happen a lot in our time with people have cell phones and they have video cameras on their phones, and so many more incidents like this are being filmed. And then you have the O.J. Simpson trial, very high-profile celebrity, one of the big football stars of the 1970s. And his trial was in some ways the reverse. He too was evidently guilty based on DNA evidence that was all over the crime scene. But he too was innocent, and that was a mostly black jury in downtown Los Angeles. And they did indicate after the trial that that was one of the reasons that they had exonerated him. It was very difficult to get a sort of post-racial or colorblind jury in the United States, and that continues to be a problem today. Moving on to chapter 18, which is the last one in this unit, we're talking about the Vietnam War. I think with the Vietnam War, well, first of all, I would say that one thing with any military chapter like this, whether it be World War II or Vietnam or later when we get into the Middle East, make sure to orient yourself geographically. Know where we're talking about here in the world. Have a globe, have an atlas up as an extra tab, and if you ever get confused, look at that map. I try to include a lot of maps in the textbook as well. Certainly if I include an animated map, that's worth looking at. Those are always better than the static version. But you can see that the United States here, they had hoped to contain communism in the Soviet Union, which is up in the north of here, and Eastern Europe, where it existed right after World War II. That didn't happen. In fact, you had a major communist revolution in China in 1949, and the United States really probably could not have done much about that anyway, short of just sending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops and dumping all kinds of money into China. Whether we even have the right to be doing that in these other countries is certainly debatable to begin with, but for whatever reason, the Truman administration decided to not take a direct stance against Chinese communism. But you can see that the United States did take a stand against its extension out in some peripheral areas, like, for instance, Korea here. Korea had been divided up north and south after World War II, with the dividing line here along the 38th parallel. And then in 1950, the communists tried to unify the country and invade the South and take over the whole country. That's when the United States, backed by the United Nations, did take a stand against communism there. Similar story happened in Vietnam, different variation on it, and you want to read about the background. But I think the most difficult part of the Vietnam War chapter is the background. I think the part that happens after the war escalates in the mid-1960s, with mainly American troops and the South Vietnamese fighting against the communist insurgents in the South and the North Vietnamese. That part is maybe a little bit more straightforward. So I want to talk here just briefly about the background to it. Back during World War II, at the beginning of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt really had the upper hand on Winston Churchill when they were negotiating with how much aid the United States should provide the British, and how many weapons we should give them, how many bases we should give them. Of course, the British were, in exchange for that, also swapped us a lot of key technology involving nuclear weapons and radar and other things. But this relationship, as of early 1941, was really one where the United States had the leverage over Britain, because Britain was the country that was then under attack by Germany during the Battle of Britain and the Blitzkrieg. And one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt was able to get out of Churchill was a declaration. It's called the Atlantic Charter, that once they won, and at the time they called themselves the United Nations, but later that term was used to describe the successor to the League of Nations. So let's just call them the Western Allies. The Western Allies, if they were victorious in World War II, one of the things that they envisioned for the post-war world was decolonization. That this idea that it was the prerogative of white people, mainly Europeans, but also Americans as well, to go gobble up whatever parts of the world they wanted, with the great scramble for Africa in the 19th century, the Middle East being carved up, as we've seen, Asia and the open door policy, all of these European colonies all over the world, the people in those parts of the world deserve independence. So decolonization was a genuine part of what the United States hoped to see accomplish after World War II. And in fact, we led the way by decolonizing the Philippines in 1946, did the United States. However, the United States was also very dedicated to stopping the expansion of communism. And you could see that not only with the Truman Doctrine and the containment strategy that kicked in right after World War II, but especially after NSC 68, National Security Council document number 68, which really considerably ramped up the Cold War effort on the part of the United States, and declared that we would not only try to stop communism in crucial areas like maybe Turkey or Iran or Greece, or areas where we felt like we had a huge strategic stake, but also throughout the entire Eurasian continent. and that we were going to now put boatloads of money into developing a new super weapon, a better weapon than the atomic bomb, which would be hydrogen bombs. We were going to pour all kinds of money into allies all over Asia, like the Philippines, for instance. We're going to build bases all over in places like Saudi Arabia and Libya. And we got, if you look at how many military bases the United States has around the world today, those of you who have been in the service are familiar with that. That really results from NSC 68 in a way. We would dedicate ourselves to amping up the war on communism. And you can see the fallout from that, I think, both with the Korean War, but especially with the Vietnam War as well, along with learning the lessons of Munich, as they call it, from World War II, the idea that, well, we should have stopped Hitler sooner rather than later. We talked in the previous unit about how that's a little bit of a complicated lesson, but that was the overriding mindset of the United States. And they also borrowed a metaphor from the French, which is we don't want the dominoes to fall in the direction of communism. So we got communism up here in China. Now North Vietnam was going to go communist, and then the next domino to fall would be Vietnam, and then Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and on and on. So the United States was really torn between two things. On the one hand, they wanted to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam from North Vietnam down into South Vietnam. On the other hand, they were dedicated to decolonization, and they were dedicated to Vietnamese independence. Ho Chi Minh, in fact, was an ally of the United States. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Northeast communists, he modeled the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence on the U.S. Declaration of Independence, partly for propaganda purposes, but partly because it made sense. After all, the United States was one of the first countries to decolonize when they broke away and declared independence from Great Britain in 1776. So the United States was stuck here a little bit, and the whole situation was playing out in the context of the Korean War, which was just winding down or at least heading toward an armistice in 1953. In 1954, world leaders from all over, including the United States, Soviet Union, etc., sat down to talk in Geneva, Switzerland, the former headquarters of the League of Nations, about what to do about this Vietnamese situation. Because the French, who had been the European country that had colonized into China in the 19th century, were losing their grip on the country. They were never able to regain their grip after World War II. They'd been so weakened by World War II, by having been overrun by Germany back in France, that enabled the Japanese to more easily come in and take over control of Indochina. As the Japanese retreated then, the Vietnamese people pushed for independence, led by Ho Chi Minh. And by the early 1950s, by the mid-1950s, they had attained independence in North Vietnam here. And the question is, what was going to happen in South Vietnam, which was the part of the country that the French still were barely hanging on to? Well, at the Geneva Conference in 1954, the world leaders decided that what they were going to do is they were going to divide the country up north and south, sort of similar to what they had done with Korea on the 38th parallel, except they would use the 17th parallel. But the difference was that they were going to solve the problem once and for all. Rather than just going on and on in perpetuity, the way the Korean situation still festers to this day, they would have countrywide elections in 1956. And whoever won those elections would then have control over all of Vietnam. Well, the United States, under Dwight Eisenhower, never agreed to the Geneva Accords. They never agreed to go along with the idea of having elections in Vietnam. Why? Because they feared, rightfully so, that Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the North Vietnamese communists, would win those elections. And so you could see where the U.S. is in a bit of a quandary there. In theory, we were in Vietnam defending democracy, yet the United States was the country that wouldn't allow elections because the wrong guy was going to win. Or some concern over the security and validity of those elections also. But what happened was that South Vietnam descended into a chaotic civil war then, because once the North realized that we were going to disallow elections, then the pressure was on the United States to move in and take a bigger role in defending South Vietnam and trying to recreate that into a new democratic country. And that never really worked. We basically sort of kicked the French out the side door there eventually, and just said, okay, this is basically our problem. If anybody's going to defend South Vietnam, it's going to have to be the South Vietnamese people themselves, and with our help. And the United States was, under both Eisenhower and John Kennedy, sending all kinds of financial aid, special forces in there to help the South Vietnamese, trying to train the South Vietnamese army, trying to help them in every way they could. But they were never able to stabilize the government of South Vietnam. They were never able to turn it into a democracy. It was really degenerating under Diem, who's pictured here, into really basically a dictatorship. And the inability then to create stability in South Vietnam eventually led, that just gave the North Vietnamese more and more momentum, and they tried to take over the South, and this is what led to the American phase then of the Vietnamese War. So that's all I have for you for this unit. I hope I was able to touch on some of the more difficult learning objectives. If not, feel free to contact me, email me, whatever you need to do. And good luck on exam 4.